For more on this, I'm joined by James Bezan of the Conservative Party here in the studio, Dominic LeBlanc of the Liberals in Moncton, and the NDP's Greg Scott in Toronto. Mr. Bezan, first question to you. Why did the government feel it's necessary to try to limit debate less than 24 hours after this massive piece of legislation was put in the House?
Don't forget that just on Monday, the NDP wanted to send it to committee immediately. So we're trying to make sure that we get through second reading and let all parties have their chance to put their ideas onto the floor. And then we'll get it into committee where they can do a real thorough study on the Act, call in the proper witnesses, and study clause by clause.
Well, what do you think, Mr. LeBlanc? Rather sudden move right into committee without even an opportunity for parliamentarians to have much debate on this.
Well, to be fair, though, the move to send it to committee before a second reading debate allows for, in the rules of the House of Commons, much broader scope in proposing amendments. So James is a little bit disingenuous in pretending that somehow they're interested in having amendments. If they were interested in having amendments, they would have accepted to send it to the committee before second reading. But at the end of the day, Bob, it's a typical Conservative tactic to cut off debate. I think they're pretending to be interested in strengthening the Elections Act when in fact there are a number of measures they're trying to pull over the eyes of Canadians that will in fact weaken election legislation. That's their real agenda, and obviously the least time possible that can be discussed, the better for the government.
Well, Mr. Scott, what are your concerns with this legislation? That you feel, do you feel that some critics have said that it's an attempt to suppress voters?
Well, it absolutely is. I mean, one of the most important things to know is that almost everything the government says about the bill, it's the inverse. So, in fact, encouraging voters is what they say, and a whole pile of voters' votes are going to be suppressed. Getting big money out of politics, in fact, it's bringing money in at least 4 or 5 new ways. The fact of it's supposedly strengthening enforcement against fraud, in fact, it's going in the other direction.
Mr. Bezan, do you feel at all, and the Elections Commissioner was not happy about the fact that Pierre Poilievre sort of suggested he was on the other team. Do you feel that Elections Canada has been biased against the Conservatives? I know you yourself had a situation where you felt that you had been mistreated by the Elections Commissioner, and they finally did right and said you had done nothing wrong. But is there a sense in your caucus that the Elections Canada is not being fair to the Conservatives?
No, and it's not the Elections Commissioner. It's the Chief Electoral Officer that we're talking about who made those comments. And the Chief Electoral Officer is the scorekeeper. He's not the referee. The referee is the Commissioner. And so we want to make sure the Commissioner has the independence and the tools and a stronger hand to bring about enforcement of any election fraud and wrongdoing during the election process. So we've been able to do that, and do that through the the Public Prosecutor's Office, where he'll now be working from, with all those resources and increased abilities to make sure that we correct all those wrongdoers and properly, including jail time now, allowing us to hold them to account.
Mr. LeBlanc, the Chief Electoral Officer has some concerns about, not so much about the move of the Elections Commissioner to the Public Prosecutor's Office, but the fact that he will not be given the tools to properly investigate. For example, they can't compel people to testify, which has been one of the stumbling blocks in getting to the bottom of the robocall scandal.
Yeah, and that's the Commissioner of Elections, Bob, who's the enforcement arm of Elections Canada, has consistently asked for that power. It's well known in other pieces of legislation. The Competition Tribunal, I think it's Section 11, gives exactly that power to investigators in the Competition Act. The Conservatives, again, have created a whole phony issue of having to move the Commissioner to the Public Prosecutor's Office. At the end of the day, a principle in law, which is very important, the prosecutorial discretion has always lied with the Director of Public Prosecutions. The Commissioner has to have access to the evidence in order to be able to make a recommendation as to whether charges should be laid. By not giving the Commissioner this power, we've seen in the example of the robocall scandal in Guelph, Ontario. I'll remind you, Bob, where a federal court judge said very clearly the only explicable source of the evidence of the fraudulent database used was that of the Conservative Party.
Mr. Bezan.
You know, what this act is all about is about increasing voter opportunities to participate in the democratic process. It's about making sure that we provide the tools to the commissioner, that we provide better education and advertising directed at increasing voter turnout and improving the democratic process. And what we're hearing from the NDP and the Liberals is just a bunch of rhetoric and throwing around all sorts of accusations without actually providing any good examples of how this bill is falling short. Peter Kingsley, the former chief electoral officer, gave it an A-. That's pretty darn good. And I think that with Mr. Kingsley's endorsement, we're moving in the right direction.
Mr. Scott, last word to you on this.
Well, the fact of the matter is so much evidence was laid out, even though we were only given a day's turnaround to start debating on it. In my speech and other speeches, really good journalists are paring back the deception of the strategy and the nuggets in this bill that are actually extraordinarily anti-democratic. Canadians are waking up to all the problems. The fact that we're offering no evidence, the getting rid of vouching, getting rid of voter identification cards is going to affect hundreds of thousands, over 100,000 people in terms of the ease with which, or the even ability to vote. That's just a start. This is a piece of deception. I wouldn't have said that so clearly if I hadn't spent about 18 hours reading it after it was tabled to find everything that had been planted in there to go in the opposite direction from what the government is actually claiming.
All right, gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we have to move on. Thank you very much.